Well, you are the diehards, aren't you? You are. You made it all the way to the end, huh? Well, thank you, first of all, for letting me join you this afternoon and be able to be part of this day and this conference and most certainly this conversation. You know, I do not have to be the one to tell you that Iowa has this unique spotlight right now, right? The Lieutenant Governor mentioned the TLC program. I'm sure you have talked about that at length today and at different points in time. And I think we are in a unique place because I think especially you are in a unique place when we think about this work because we have an opportunity, you have an opportunity to help that spotlight either be blinding or bright, right? So I think this is a magnificent chance for us to think about elevating teacher leadership throughout the state and elevating what that looks like in our schools and in our buildings. But I also think that it is a tenuous line that we walk, and I think it could be very easy to misunderstand what that could look like in the classroom, and that's what I'm here for this afternoon. I come to you as a teacher. I come to you as somebody who is, thinking about my lesson plans for tomorrow and thinking about Carl, who had all of these questions this morning, and I got to figure out how I got to make it work for him tomorrow. And I think that that's an important part of this conversation, and I hope that that's the component of this conversation that I can help participate in today. So the first question that I have for us, though, is a question about what teaching actually looks like. Maybe we'll get it, maybe we won't. There we go. So I've got some images for you, and I'm going to ask you to talk about them here in just a second. So these are some teacher images. Some of them may look familiar to you. In the upper left-hand corner, we have To Sir with Love, from the film Dangerous Minds, Lean on Me. A little bit more obscure one called The Emperor's Club, Stand and Deliver, Freedom Writer's Diary, and then of course, Dead Poet Society. So I'm gonna ask you to talk. I'm a teacher and I don't do very well if people in the room are not talking to each other. So I want you to talk about the kinds of teacher myths that are being perpetuated in these images. All right, I'm gonna give you about a minute. All right, I'm gonna bring you back in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. You know why I'm having you talk, right? Because we know that the people doing the talking are the people doing the learning. And we know that that's true in classrooms, and we know that's true wherever we go. So that's why it's important that you get some talk time. So how many of you talked about the teacher being the center of this? Yeah? How many of you said something about like the sage on the stage, or the teacher knows everything, or the teacher maybe is a savior, or something like that? Yeah? Did any of you, are there any film buffs in here? Or photography buffs? Did you talk about the angles? I don't know if you know this about photography and film, but these are all shot at a low angle, which means the camera is down low and it makes the subject look really huge and powerful, right? Did any of you maybe talk about some of these teachers actually being rebels? If you know a little bit about the films, did any of you mention that? Okay. So I think that these are all important observations because I think these are myths about what teaching is really like, right? We think that teaching looks like somebody in the front of the classroom. In fact, I know I'm having a really good day in the classroom when somebody walks in and they can't find me, right? That's how I know I'm having a good teaching day. So I've got some different images for you now, okay? So the question is just the opposite, right? What teacher myths are being dispelled in these images? So let's take a look at what we've got. Top left-hand corner, we have Mr. Rogers. In the center, somebody named James Lipton. Did any of you watch Inside the Actors Studio, or do you watch Inside the Actors Studio? Okay, this is a little confession moment here. I will tell you, I think I learned as much about teaching in my first couple of years from James Lipton as I did from anyone other than the students in my room. Because he does these interviews and he brings all these celebrities to this stage and he asks them these questions, but he doesn't ask them any questions about being a celebrity. He doesn't ask them any questions about promoting their next film. He asks them about the craft of acting. And I remember watching these interviews, and I have this tendency to get obsessed with things that once I am in, like I just can't stop, right? So I remember watching these episodes and realizing that the same way these actors were talking about their craft applied to what I was doing. And that sometimes I would go to professional development and people would give me paper. And they would say, this is kind of like a script. And if you would do this strategy or you would follow these steps, then you would have this great classroom. But that was following a script. And what James Lipton was teaching me is that's not what great acting is, that's not what great teaching is, that's not what craft is, right? Craft is something very, very different. So I know it's a little extra thing there. Okay, then we have Julia Child. In the middle, we have Adam Levine, who you can barely see. He's from The Voice, you might know that. The legendary coach, Pat Summitt, and then a screenshot from one of my favorite documentaries called Euro Dreams of Sushi, which is about the sushi master and his craft. All right, so I'm gonna give you about a minute to talk, to turn and talk. What kind of teacher myths are being dispelled here? All right, back in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So how many of you talked about these people being active? Maybe actually doing the thing they were teaching, right? How many of you noticed that they were more like coaches or facilitators, something like that? Did you notice that? Okay. Did any of you, I mean, like I even think about Julia Child. What's so endearing about her? What do we love about Julia Child? She makes mistakes, right? She's endearing because she makes mistakes. And if we think about the images that we just saw in those films, we saw teachers who didn't make mistakes unless they were scripted, right? Which is really different than a Julia Child kind of mistake. So when we look at the differences between the images of teaching in that first montage and the images of teaching in this montage, I think we have a pretty important dissonance between the two, right? And I think this question about what is great teaching has to be the first question that we answer before we can think about what teacher leadership looks like. Because if teacher leadership looks like a version of a lot of people standing in front of classrooms, reading scripts, and following someone else's plan, we're not getting craft, we're not getting teaching. I think that formulas create standardization. So I get to work with a lot of teachers in a lot of different places around the country, and a lot of times they'll say things to me like, Sarah, I will do whatever you want me to do if you just tell me what it is. Just tell me what to do, and I will do it. Have any of you heard this from teachers? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Right. And I always, it's a great conversation starter because I can always say, if you think it's that linear, this is the best we're ever gonna get. The best we're ever gonna get is a paint by number of a masterpiece. Because you can have something that will tell you which colors to put in which spaces. But what we know is that artists create masterpieces. And that if we want to have uncommon teaching, we have to have really messy hands. Great teaching isn't always pretty, right? It's oftentimes really messy, and it oftentimes doesn't make a lot of sense until this moment of epiphany, right? So sometimes I rely on my own children. I have 3 kids. I have an 11-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 5-year-old. And sometimes I rely on them to teach me the very best lessons about this work that we are all so passionate about. And a while ago, I had been traveling a little bit, and I had a Saturday afternoon with my daughter. And I asked her, I said, Lauren, what would you like to play? And she said, Mom, I want to play school. And I said, okay. Because I have to tell you, I had been waiting for my daughter to ask me to play school with her, right? So I said, yeah, Lauren, we could play school. I said, how do we do that? And she said, well, you can be the teacher and I'll be the student. And I said, I can do that. I said, but what does the teacher do? She said, well, you can give me something to work on and I'll go sit at my desk and do it. And then I'll bring it back to you and you can tell me if I did a good job. And then you can give me something else to do and I'll go sit at my desk to do it and I'll bring it back to you and you can tell me if I did a good job. And I'm thinking, oh, I have got like the cutest kid ever, right? Until about 15 seconds later, when I was entirely mortified. Because I wondered, is this what my daughter thinks I do all day? Does she think that I hand out papers and pick them up and tell kids that they were good or bad or right or wrong? That's playing the game of school. It's not teaching, it's not learning. Our job is to transcend the game of school. It is our challenge and our responsibility. I think it's really what brings us here today. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we elevate the right kind of work, right? That becomes, I think, another really important question. And I have to say, I asked that question and I think a little bit about Pinterest. I haven't really been bit by the Pinterest bug. Who in here has been bit by the Pinterest bug? We've got some, yeah? So a lot of people tell me it's really amazing and wonderful, and they say it's fantastic because you can create these like imaginary worlds, like this dream house, right? Or this dream closet, or whatever it might be. The world's biggest recipe box. And so, we have this infatuation with collecting, and teachers are not immune to this, right? Teachers are not immune to collecting things. And sometimes I kind of think, we could have a teacher's Pinterest board that might look a little bit like this, right? Have you seen these ketchup bottle paint things? I don't know, they're really cool. They're really, because paint is messy and you get to see the colors and they're really pretty. This is something lots of teachers pin on their Pinterest boards. In the middle there's like a bulletin board, there's a science experiment, this is some literary analysis stuff, and what teacher does not want another graphic organizer, right? But I wish teachers' Pinterest boards looked a little different than this. I wish that teachers' Pinterest boards looked a lot more like this. I wish that instead of collecting things, we would think about collecting instruction. Because there's a big difference between the two. And I think it comes down to the difference between how we think about the work that we do every day. The difference between having the kind of work that is about completing tasks and the kind of work that has purpose. So for me, this comes down to the difference in 2 questions I can ask myself every morning. I can get up and I can ask myself, well, what are we going to do today, right? And I got to tell you, I've asked myself that question. What are we going to do today? Do you know who I'm thinking about when I ask myself that question? I'm actually thinking about myself. I'm thinking about, well, do I have enough planned? Is it going to take up the whole class period? What if my principal walks in? Is it going to look like the right thing that we are doing, right? Or I can ask myself a different question in the morning. I can say, what are they going to learn today? And I have to tell you, when I ask myself that question, there's actually a cognitive shift in my brain. I see their faces. I really do. I see their faces. I see Amra's face. And I ask myself, well, what did Amra learn yesterday? What does she need to learn today? How am I going to get her there? That is the difference between teaching because of task and scripts and teaching with the purpose of students in mind. I know that we come to places like these conferences and we have these conversations and we want answers. We want to be able to take something back, right? I know, we want to take the thing back that's going to make it all easier and better. And I think sometimes we wish for that so desperately that we don't recognize the intrinsic process that we have to engage in, right? That this is about a process for learning. It's not about that thing. So here are some pictures. I want you to picture what a classroom could look like, especially a Common Core classroom, okay? So I think if we could picture a Common Core classroom, we could picture less of teachers lecturing, more of teachers modeling. Less of students sitting and listening, more of students constructing meaning together. Less of teachers turning textbook pages, and more of teachers formatively assessing for their next steps. I think we could see classrooms where there's less of students recalling and more of students transferring learning to new experiences, where there are less examples of students reading from secondary sources, which are like textbooks and articles that have already been condensed, to getting them to read primary sources. When we start to think about what this really looks like, I think that helps us think about how do we support and prepare our teacher leaders to go into classrooms that don't look like the classrooms that we have been in before, right? It has to look different than that. So I wonder, what do teacher leaders look like? Well, I know this. I know that teacher leaders have to be more strategic than just having a playbook of strategies. That it's not about a big binder. It's not about having gone to a lot of conferences and being able to say, well, this person said do this and this person said do that. That's not what a teacher leader is. A teacher leader is somebody who's willing to have really messy hands. A teacher leader is somebody who's willing to say, let's try this together. And let's be strategic about the learners in front of us and have that be the first question we ask rather than go to the binder of strategies, right? And I think when we think about this strategy, it can look like this, right? So this is a strategy that I use in my classroom, these pattern folders, right? And I have a lot of teachers around the country who ask me about this strategy, the pattern folders, and they want to know, all right, what is the very first thing you do on the first day? And what is the and then what do you do the next day? They want to know exactly what it is. And then, so a lot of times I'll Skype into their classrooms and I'll talk to them about these kinds of things. And, really quickly they find out that there's not a lockstep process, right? Because it's about those learners. So that might be the strategy, but really this is the strategic part, right? The strategic part is when it's the teacher and the student, because the most important work that we do is this kind of human work. So I have a little request for you, all right? I'm gonna give you 60 seconds. I want you to take the very best selfie you can in 60 seconds. All right, are you up for it? Can you do it? Say, yes, I can do it. All right, let's go. 60 seconds, the very best selfie you can. Off you go. Oh, you gotta stay here? Is that a good photo bomb? All right, you're down to 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, let me ask you some questions. All right, let me ask you some questions about these selfies. All right, so how many of you adjusted the phone camera at all before you took the picture? At all? Yeah? All right, how many of you adjusted yourselves? Like maybe you elongated your neck a little bit? Did you do that? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, yeah? How many of you took more than one picture? How many of you? Okay, let me ask you this. If you were gonna post this picture, how many of you would filter it first? Probably, right? Okay, so here's the question. The question is, think about all of the adjustments that you were willing to make in 60 seconds to take the best selfie you could. The question becomes about teacher leaders. Who are the people in your buildings who are willing to put that kind of a lens on their practice and make those kinds of adjustments over and over again in order to have the best classrooms that they can, right? Teacher leaders are not necessarily people who are models. Teacher leaders are people who are willing to put this lens on themselves, because that's how we get better, right? That's how we get better in this profession. So teacher leaders have to be open with their practice, not insular. And I think this is one of the most important changes that I would love to advocate for in this state as I see TLC rolling out, is I see this idea that, we've created these models out of teachers, and we talk about them like I don't know, like they're almost a figurine or something, right? Like, here they are, the models of what good teaching is. But the truth of the matter is that I am not a good teacher every day. I'm not. I try to be every day, but I don't get it right every day. But what I can do is I can be deliberate, and I can be reflective, and I can read reality rapidly so that I can make the necessary changes to be a better teacher tomorrow, right? I think that's what teacher leaders have to be, and they have to be willing to be really open and vulnerable about that part of their practice. So when we ask teachers to be these kind of innovators, I think we also have to remember that we are asking them to take another kind of risk. Because a lot of times, the price of innovation is isolation. And some of you maybe already know that, right? Some of you maybe already know that you have teacher leaders in your schools, in buildings, who are innovators, and then they are also ostracized. Because I will tell you, this is sometimes my own truth, not all of the time, but sometimes it is. Because sometimes it takes me a while to get the kids on board, right? They come into class, those first week, they're like, ooh, what's going on here? We're not quite sure what this is all about. But eventually I get them, right? Like eventually I win them over, and that's about the time when I lose the adults in my hallway, right? And I think we have to remember that this is part of this experience for teachers. And you probably have teachers who are going through that. And they need to understand this, and they need to find networks that are gonna help to support them in that work. Because this work that we are doing, this work of teacher leadership, it is not about storms. It is about planting seeds. It is about remembering and knowing that asking a really good question is always better than giving a good answer, right? Because it's the question that's the catalyst. It's the question that gets somebody else to construct their own learning, which is what we want, right? We want lots of teachers to construct their own learning about what effective classrooms look like. So when we think about this, I think we have to think a little bit more systematically, right? So how can we nurture cultures in our buildings that really sustain growth and change? It's not an easy thing to do at all. I think we have to understand the difference between what we say and what we live. So here's an example. On the first day of class, I have students come in, and I take attendance, and then I tell everybody to sit in a circle on the floor in the classroom. And I take out a copy, I give everybody a copy of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and I read it out loud to them. And instead of giving them a syllabus or the rules or my expectations, I say, I have one question for you. By the end of class today, I want you to tell me what this class is all about. So we read this allegory together, and they tell me this, right, by the end of class. And I share this anecdote with you because I'm telling you, I could write a really pretty syllabus. I could make it really pretty. Really beautiful one, and say all of the right things about how I want them to construct their learning and about how I respect them and how we're gonna have this trusting environment, and I could stand in the front of the class the whole time and I could talk at them. And when they leave, what are they gonna take away? Are they gonna take away that this classroom is theirs? No, they're gonna take away that these are my rules, right? These are my expectations. So there is a difference between the things that we say and then the messages that we live with. And we have to remember that this is part of this role of creating culture. Maybe we'll get there. How many of you are familiar with Carol Dweck? I'm guessing a lot of you. Yeah. So if you aren't familiar with Carol Dweck, I put her on your must-read list, the very top of your list. Her work has really changed a lot about how I see education. She talks about the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset. And if we want to have cultures in our schools and in our districts and our buildings that embrace this kind of work, this kind of messy work, we have to be prepared to have a growth mindset. So probably the best way I can explain this growth mindset is to bring you into my kitchen at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, my kids come home, right? They pull out their bags and they pull out the folders, and out of the folders come papers, right? And you know, my Evan might pull out a paper and there might be a sticker or a star at the top of it. Carol Dweck would say, if I wanted to cultivate a fixed mindset, I would say something like this: Evan, I am so proud of you. Look how smart you are. You got all of those answers right. You're so smart, right? There's a problem with this. One day, Evan's gonna come home. He's gonna take out that paper, and there's not gonna be a sticker or a star at the top. And if all I've told my son is, I'm so proud of you because you're smart, what is he gonna think that day? That's right, that he's not smart anymore, right? It's a fixed mindset. Fixed mindsets create dichotomies. It's either or. You're either smart or you're not. You're good or you're bad. You're right or you're wrong. You're proficient or you're not, right? So growth mindset looks different. Evan comes home, takes out the papers, sticker and the star at the top, fine. It's good to know, but I don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. I asked him a couple of questions instead. I said, what did you learn today? What are you curious about? What do you want to learn next? Did you ask a good question today? Because that's the rule. Got to ask a good question, right? The difference between having fixed mindsets and growth mindsets are really crucial in creating cultures in which we can have teacher leaders do this kind of work. So I've been thinking a lot about the dispositions that we need in these cultures. And as I think about this, I think that there are some different qualities that we need to think about. Cultures of learning, deeper learning, and instructional design. And if we think about how to mix those, I'm not sure where, there we go. If we mix culture and deeper learning, we'll see teachers who are posing questions and students are creating solutions. When we combine cultures of learning and strong instructional design, we're gonna see that teachers know their content really deeply. So this is also important, that they have a really deep content knowledge, because they too are readers and writers and designers and doing all those things in the second montage of images, right? They're actually doing the work that they're trying to teach. When we combine deeper learning and instructional design, we're gonna see teachers who privilege process and ideas, thinking over answers, students who are willing to struggle in really productive ways. So when we take all of these together, we're going to see a degree of practiced dispositions and robust content that creates really purposeful learning, right? So this is the difference between the task and the purpose, right? And I think that's what's important in the work that we're doing. So I think oftentimes about failure. And I think a lot about failure. I think a lot about the importance of failure. And in fact, the bridge to success, I think, oftentimes comes to us from failure. One of my great idols of all time has some important words of wisdom about this.
I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed.
That might be familiar to a lot of you already. One of my favorites, I was a basketball player, and I gotta tell you, when I think of Michael Jordan, I just don't think failure. That's just not the word that pops into my head. But when he frames it that way, we see how crucial it is to success, right? It has to be part of that configuration. I had a chance to spend some time at IDEO Solutions. I don't know if you know about IDEO or not. If you don't, you gotta look them up. They're really cool. It's a really cool organization. I got to spend some time at their Chicago office. And essentially what other consumer companies take their problems to IDEO, right? So maybe somebody needs to build a better bike, or maybe somebody needs to brand their hospital differently, and they just have this amazing process in how they go about solving problems. And in fact, they expect failure. They expect that they will get the wrong solution probably 90 times before they get the right one. And I loved just kind of listening to this and hearing them talk about how they embrace this failure. And so while I was there, they were getting ready to have this Permission to Fail conference. And it really reminded me of one of my own mantras about teaching, which is that I am more afraid of my mediocrity than I am of my mistakes. And I know that if I don't own my mistakes and I can't learn from them, then I'm kind of destined to plateau, right? So I think that's part of this equation that we're talking about. I had a chance to fail in front of a really large audience. For 4.5 years, I served as the teacher laureate for a nonprofit called the Teaching Channel out of San Francisco, and they have a website, and what they do is they go into teachers' classrooms, they film them teaching, they create these really usable videos, and then teachers can watch them for free online. And it's just a really wonderful resource to get teachers to think about teaching and learning in different ways. So they came to my classroom, and they had been there maybe about 8 or 9 times. When at the end of one of the days of filming, one of the cameramen said, "You know, Sarah, knock on wood, we haven't had a bad lesson yet." And I think the thing is, when you say something superstitious like that, you're actually supposed to follow through, right? Clearly he did not, because the next morning we all gathered back there, and I'm teaching this lesson to my sophomores, and it is a disaster. It is a total train wreck, just awful. And it's not the first time that I've ever taught a bad lesson, of course, right? But it is the first time I'd ever taught a bad lesson with 2 cameras and 3 boom microphones in the room. And so at the end of this lesson, the same cameraman says, "You know, Sarah, I don't know. I just don't think Teaching Channel is going to want to use that one." And I said, "Oh, yes, they will." And I said, and here are the 3 reasons why. I said, number 1, I only agreed to do this work if they would film what really happened in the classroom, good or bad. I said, number 2, you don't catch this kind of mistake on film very often. And it proved to be very true, because when they did eventually put it online, within 48 hours, it had like 40,000 hits. So lots of people want to see failure. And the 3rd reason is because somebody has to go first. When we think about teacher leadership, I think we have to ask the question, who's willing to go first? Not who's willing to be the best or to be perfect, but who's willing to go first. So we don't have time to watch all of this video, but if you would like to, you can see all kinds of versions on the Teaching Channel. You can see the 14-minute version. You can see the 2 30-minute uncut versions. There's all kinds of disaster there, just waiting for you if you want to see it. I want to end this afternoon, though, talking about my students. And these are some images from our classroom. One day, we do this poetry thing, and one day we get books and start tearing pages out of books. I know if there are teacher librarians in here, they're probably squirming. And we turn those pages into new poetry. We have down here at the bottom, when we analyze texts, we don't ever just start off writing papers. We always have to transfer that to another form first. There was a Twitter war we ended up getting in with the school in Wisconsin, because we were all trying to throw poetry out into the universe during April National Poetry Month. The bottom down here, they finally convinced me to, so I had this class. Actually, one of my students' dads is in the room right now, in this class, and they kept saying, "Can we have a party? Can we have a party?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not doing a party. We got stuff to do. We're not having a party." And so finally, they wore me down, right? So it's like 2/3 of the way through the year. They wear me down, and I said, "All right, here's the deal." I said, "We can have a party if you're willing to do like a Wessling kind of party." And they looked at each other and they said, "Well, do we get food?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Fine, As long as we get food, we'll do whatever. So we came up together with this idea that we would create this literary character dinner party day. And I have to tell you, it was truly one of the best days of teaching in 18 years. It really was. They were just amazing. They stayed in character. I had created all these unpredictable moments for them that would happen throughout this experience. It was kind of like a murder mystery without the murder of the mystery. The same year, I also made a decision between task and purpose. I've been giving final exams, right? And constantly just feeling like they were pretty perfunctory because, or at least a portion of them. Students always do these portfolios and the reflective part always felt really good. But the other portion just, I wasn't really learning anything new about them, to be honest, and they weren't really showing me anything that they hadn't already done. So I decided a couple of years ago that the final exam would be a prompt or an invitation or a challenge, however you want to call it. And I said, here's the final exam is that you will all deliver a commencement address that cannot be cliche. And that was it. I didn't give them a rubric. Didn't give them a list of things that they should have in it. I will tell you, we watched a lot of really bad commencement speeches, and we watched a lot of really brilliant ones. And they figured out what would go into a really great commencement speech that wasn't cliche. And then they delivered them, and we had this amazing week where all these students stood up and told their stories, and I want to share one of those with you. So Ben came to our class about a third of the way through the year. Really quiet, worked hard, did his stuff, had a really hard time getting him to talk out loud. He would work with small groups, but not in the whole class very often. He stands up to give his speech. And he says, I don't know if all of you know my story. Some of you might know part of it, but I've decided that today is the day I'm going to tell it. And he tells us that when Ben was a hockey player. When he was a freshman, he moved to Colorado to play hockey. And at the beginning of his junior year, he came home, got in an ATV accident, nearly lost his arm. It was hanging on by a ligament and was about 10 minutes away from losing his life. He rehabbed for the year. And at the beginning of his senior year, he went back to Colorado because you know what? Ben's a hockey player. Ben's going to be a hockey player, right? So he goes to Colorado. And of course, he had to go because he had to find out for himself what probably his family and other people close to him knew, which was that Ben's arm was never going to work the way that it had worked before the accident, and he was going to come home not being that hockey player. So that's what brought him to our class. And he came to this class, and he didn't have none of his friends were in this class. It wasn't his peer group. His older sister had taken this class like about 7 years prior to that, and she said that you should do this, so that's why he was there. And he tells this part of the story. And then, I don't know if you know this, but a lot of times when kids give speeches, they constantly look at the teacher. Like they're kind of constantly looking for affirmation. Are you hearing me? Am I getting my points? Am I doing the right thing, right? Ben he stops looking at me entirely. It's like I'm not even in the room. And he looks at the rest of the kids in the class. And he said, I want to tell you the rest of my story. And the rest of my story is that I have learned this year that I might not be a hockey player, but I'm going to be okay because I have a brain. And I didn't know that until you showed me that. You used words I didn't know, but you let me learn them. You talked about things I didn't understand, but you waited until I understood. And at the end of that speech, I can tell you that there was not a dry eye in the room. All 30 of us were sobbing, and when he walked out of the room, the first thing I did was pick up the phone and call his mom and say, you cannot believe what your son just did. Ben reminds me all of the time about why we teach. We teach because this work is human work. We don't teach because we are robots. We don't teach to fulfill a script. We don't teach to check off boxes. We teach so that we can see in young people what they cannot see in themselves. Thank you.